It was a Tuesday night at Redwood General Hospital, and the air was thick with an unnatural quiet. The corridors stretched out in empty silence, interrupted only by the soft hum of machines in vacant patient rooms. Ben, a young security guard in training, had taken this job to make ends meet, and until now, every shift had been boringly predictable. But tonight felt different. Flickering lights cast uneasy shadows on the walls, and there was a smell, something faintly metallic that he couldn't place. Ben shifted uncomfortably, his gaze drifting toward the old wing of the hospital, an area closed off since an incident years ago. Rumors whispered among the staff haunted his mind, tales of shadows in the halls and voices that no one could trace. The hospital was quiet, too quiet, as if it held its breath. Ben felt it, a chill crawling up his spine, like something lurking just beyond the hallway shadows, waiting for him to notice. Ben's radio crackled to life with static. He adjusted it, expecting a routine update from the head nurse, but the line remained silent, only the faint buzz of static breaking the quiet. Suddenly, through the static, he heard a whisper. It was faint, almost indistinguishable, a soft, pleading voice saying, "Help me, down here. Alone?" Ben froze, his heartbeat quickening as he looked around. He was near the entrance to the abandoned wing, the part of the hospital no one was allowed into anymore. Everyone knew about the incident there, though few spoke of it, only hinting at stories of patients who disappeared without a trace. He pressed the radio button, calling back. "Hello? Who is this?" Silence. Then, just as he was about to turn away, the voice came again, clearer this time. "Please, don't leave me here." It was followed by a faint sound, a soft, distant tapping, like footsteps echoing from the darkened hallway. Ben's hands were slick with sweat. His instincts told him to turn around, to forget it, but a strange pull made him hesitate, his feet inching toward the abandoned hallway, as the tapping grew louder, almost beckoning him in. Ben couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on him as he stepped closer to the door leading into the abandoned hospital wing. His hand hovered over the doorknob, his pulse quickening. He could still hear the faint tapping coming from within, rhythmic and deliberate, like footsteps growing louder with each second. As he pushed the door open, the stale air hit him, thick and musty. Shadows danced along the walls as the light flickered, casting long, ominous shapes down the narrow corridor. Ben took a cautious step inside, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. The further he walked, the colder the air became, chilling him to the bone despite the heavy uniform he wore. Then, just as he reached the middle of the hall, the tapping stopped. A silence fell, heavy and unnatural. He held his breath, straining to hear any sign of movement, but there was only silence. Suddenly, the lights above him flickered violently, plunging him into near darkness. Panic clawed at his throat as he fumbled for his flashlight, its beam shaky and weak. The shadows seemed to close in around him, thick and suffocating. And then, from somewhere deep in the darkness, he heard it, a soft, dragging sound, like something being pulled along the floor. Frozen in place, Ben's eyes scanned the darkness, his flashlight trembling in his hand. Slowly, the dragging grew closer, each scratch of metal on tile louder than the last, echoing in the hollow silence. His heart hammered in his chest, and he realized with chilling clarity, he wasn't alone. Something was moving towards him, just beyond the reach of his light. Just as Ben steeled himself to turn back, a loud crash reverberated from the depths of the abandoned wing. The sound was unmistakable, a metal door slamming shut, echoing ominously through the corridor. His heart raced as he spun around, the beam of his flashlight trembling wildly. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaking as it bounced off the walls. There was no response, just that haunting silence pressing in on him. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and for a split second, he saw her. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway, hair matted and eyes wide with a mix of fear and desperation. It was a patient, he realized, but she looked so frail, so broken. "Help me," she mouthed silently, reaching out toward him, her fingers clawing at the air as if begging him to come closer. But before he could move, the lights went out completely, plunging him into darkness. He heard a shuffling sound approaching him, something dragging across the floor. He felt an icy breath on his neck and whispered in the darkness, "Ben, you shouldn't have come here." Ben's heart pounded in his chest as the shadowy figure drew closer, the hallway closing in around him. He could barely breathe, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and something more foul, something rotten. His instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt glued to the floor. "Help me!" The voice echoed again, a haunting melody that sent shivers down his spine. As he turned to flee, the lights flickered one last time, illuminating the corridor just enough for him to see the gaunt face of the woman, her eyes wide and pleading, filled with a desperation that sent a chill through him. With a primal scream, he stumbled backward, the floor beneath him seeming to shift as if the very building was alive, shifting and closing in. He turned to sprint away, but as he did, the floor groaned, and the lights above burst with a shower of sparks. The hallway plunged into darkness, and the whispers grew louder, surrounding him and suffocating him. He stumbled blindly, slamming into a wall as the air turned frigid. He felt cold fingers brushing against his neck, and he turned, his heart racing as he faced the darkness. Suddenly, the lights flickered back to life, revealing not just the woman but a crowd of shadowy figures lurking just behind her. They were all patients, their faces twisted in agony, mouths moving silently as if pleading for help. "Join us, Ben," the woman whispered, her voice now a sinister hiss. The figures lurched forward, and he could see their bony fingers reaching out, beckoning him into the shadows. In a surge of adrenaline, Ben bolted for the exit. The figures screamed in unison, a chilling cacophony that echoed through the halls, drowning out his own terrified shouts. As he reached the door, he yanked it open, the cold air rushing in as he tumbled out into the parking lot, gasping for breath. But as he turned to look back, the hospital loomed ominously behind him, the lights flickering one last time before everything fell silent again. In the eerie stillness, he felt an unmistakable dread creeping back in. Whatever had been in there was still lurking, waiting for its next victim. As Ben stumbled out into the parking lot, he thought he had escaped the horror of the hospital. But the relief was short-lived. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow on the building behind him, which loomed larger than life, as if it were alive. He turned to look back, a chill running down his spine as he realized the windows were filled with shadowy figures, all staring directly at him. Their mouths moved in unison, forming a silent scream that echoed in his mind. Just then, his phone buzzed violently in his pocket, and he answered it, only to hear the voice of the woman from the hospital, her chilling words freezing him in place. "You can't leave us, Ben. We're waiting for you." He backed away slowly, but deep down, he knew. The darkness had already seeped into his soul. The old university library always felt strange after hours, but on a stormy Thursday night, the place was downright eerie. Amelia, the night librarian, had spent countless shifts alone, surrounded by rows of dusty, ancient books that seemed to whisper in the silence. The usual hum of student chatter was gone, replaced by the steady tap of rain against the library's tall, arched windows. She stacked the last of the returned books, pausing as she noticed one lying on the floor, a thick, leather-bound tome that didn't belong to any section she knew. When she bent to pick it up, a shadow flickered at the edge of her vision, disappearing into the rows just as quickly. Amelia's heart began to beat faster. Something about the silence tonight felt heavier, as if the library itself was holding its breath, watching. And there, in the flickering lamplight, she thought she saw a figure peeking out from between the shelves. Amelia brushed off the flickering shadow she'd seen, chalking it up to tired eyes. She returned to shelving books when the lamp on her desk began to flicker violently, throwing strange, twisting shadows across the library floor. She stepped back, and as her eyes adjusted, she noticed something odd. A figure standing at the far end of the aisle, barely visible in the dim light. It was a man, or at least, that's what it looked like. A silhouette, tall and thin, with his head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing in the silence. The figure didn't move or respond, just stood there, watching. Amelia's hands trembled as she took a step closer. She'd never seen anyone like this before, and something about the man's stillness was all wrong. He was frozen, as if locked in place, and yet, she had the creeping feeling that he was moving, only she couldn't see it. She blinked, and in that moment, the figure vanished. A chill slid down her spine as she clutched her book cart, her mind racing. She could still feel eyes on her, hidden somewhere in the shadows, watching. Amelia tried to shake off the unsettling sight of the figure, telling herself it was just a trick of the dim lighting. But the library felt different now, as if it were watching her with unseen eyes. The silence was oppressive, heavy, interrupted only by the occasional rustle of pages in the breeze. She moved through the aisles, shelving the last of the books, but couldn't escape the sensation that something was following her, moving just out of sight. Each time she turned, she caught a glimpse, a shadow slipping around a corner, a dark figure standing just at the edge of her vision, disappearing the moment she tried to focus. As she reached the far corner of the library, a sudden, low creaking filled the air. It sounded like an old door opening, echoing through the empty space. She froze, her heart pounding in her ears, as the creak gave way to faint footsteps, soft and deliberate, as if someone was slowly approaching. Amelia's breath hitched as she felt a chill creep up her spine. She strained her ears, listening, but the footsteps stopped just as abruptly as they'd started. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on her. Yet the feeling remained, that horrible sensation of someone, or something, standing just behind her, watching, waiting. Amelia stood frozen, the weight of dread pressing down on her as the shadows shifted around her. Just then, the faint sound of pages flipping caught her attention, drawing her toward the nearby reading room. As she approached, the air grew heavier, and the whispers resumed, filling her ears with unintelligible murmurs. She hesitated, feeling a primal urge to flee, but curiosity held her in place. When she finally stepped inside, the lights flickered above, casting eerie shapes on the walls. Her heart raced as she spotted the leather-bound tome, the one she had seen lying on the floor earlier, sitting open on a table, the pages fluttering as if someone were reading it. She felt a chill run through her, and just as she reached for the book, the whispers crescendoed into a deafening cacophony. Then, in an instant, the pages slammed shut, and the lights went out. Amelia's breath caught in her throat, and just as she turned to run, a voice whispered right behind her, "You shouldn't have touched that." The whispering grew louder, swirling around Amelia like a storm, filling her mind with dread. The shadows deepened in the library, curling around her like tendrils of smoke. The book lay open on the table, pages flapping violently, as if the very words were alive, desperate to escape. "Get away from it!" A voice screamed from nowhere, a warning that echoed through the stillness. But it was too late. As she reached out to close the book, the air grew colder, and she felt an invisible force push her back. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. In that suffocating blackness, Amelia felt hands grabbing her, pulling her toward the table, the shadows pressing in closer and closer. "Help us!" A chorus of voices cried, each more anguished than the last. She could feel the weight of their despair crashing over her like a tidal wave, and panic surged within her. Then, the lights returned, illuminating the reading room, but it was no longer empty. The figure she had seen before stood right in front of her, eyes glowing like embers, a wide grin splitting its face. Its hands stretched toward her, fingers twisting in an unnatural way. "Join us, Amelia," it beckoned, the voice dripping with malice. She stumbled backward, her heart racing as she grabbed the nearest chair, ready to defend herself. But as she turned, the walls began to close in, books flying off the shelves, pages ripping free, swirling around her like a whirlwind of terror. The whispers grew deafening, drowning out her screams. With nowhere to run, Amelia threw herself toward the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. The figure advanced, shadows swirling around it, as the whispers morphed into chilling laughter. Just as she thought she would be consumed by the darkness, The lights flickered again, and for a split second, she saw a way out, a fleeting glimpse of the library's exit. But the shadows closed in, and she was engulfed in darkness once more. Amelia found herself alone in the library, the shadows once more enveloping her. The voices had faded, replaced by a suffocating silence that pressed against her. She thought she had escaped the horror, but the truth lay buried deep within her. As she reached for the door, she felt a cold breeze, and in its wake, the whispers returned, quieter but more insistent, creeping into her thoughts. She hesitated, glancing back at the table where the book lay open, its pages fluttering like wings. "Help us!" The voice of the figure echoed in her mind, intertwining with her thoughts. When she finally stepped outside, the library seemed to shift behind her, the walls distorting. As she walked away, the whispers faded, but a lingering dread settled in her chest. It wasn't over. The shadows had followed her, and they would always be waiting. Midnight at Grayson Steel Plant was an unsettling sight. The machinery stood silent, hulking figures in the dark, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched across the floor. Marcus, working the graveyard shift, always felt a strange tension here at night. The air was thick, still, and reeked faintly of oil and rust. He walked through the vast, empty factory floor, checking gauges and making his rounds as usual. As he moved, the silence felt oppressive, pressing in from all sides, broken only by the occasional groan of metal settling. Marcus thought he heard a soft shuffle behind him but found only empty space when he turned. But the strangest thing was the rhythmic clanking sound that seemed to echo from somewhere in the shadows. It wasn't from any machine he knew. Everything was shut down at this hour. Yet the sound grew louder, like footsteps echoing off steel. The hairs on his neck prickled as he realized he was not alone. Marcus continued his rounds, muttering to himself to break the eerie silence. But as he approached the main assembly line, he noticed something strange. A single machine had been left running, its gears grinding rhythmically. This was odd. He was sure he'd powered it down earlier. He moved closer, peering into the dim light as the clanking sound grew louder. The machine seemed to be whispering. He shook his head, thinking he'd misheard, but then he heard it again. Soft murmurs, rising and falling in time with the gears, like hushed voices locked in conversation. A cold sweat ran down Marcus's face. There shouldn't be anyone here. He was supposed to be alone. As he reached out to turn off the machine, a shadow crossed his peripheral vision. He spun around, but the vast room was empty, its metal and wires reflecting dimly in the factory lights. The whispers continued, echoing from somewhere deep in the machinery, and a faint, scratchy laugh trickled out from the shadows. Suddenly, the machine stopped, its gears grinding to a halt, leaving him in an unnatural silence that felt heavier than the noise. Marcus tried to shrug off the eerie whispers he'd heard, convincing himself it was just the hum of machinery settling. But as he continued his rounds, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every step he took echoed in the vast factory floor, each sound swallowed by the empty, cavernous space. The air grew colder, the metallic scent sharper, filling his nose with a tang of rust. He glanced at the machinery surrounding him, its lifeless frames casting grotesque shadows that seemed to stretch and twist. Just as he reached the far end of the factory, a sharp clang echoed through the silence, followed by another, then another, until it sounded like someone was hammering at one of the machines. Marcus spun around, searching for the source of the noise, but all he saw was darkness and the unsettling stillness of unmoving metal. His flashlight flickered as he walked forward, its beam barely piercing the thick, stifling air. Then he heard it again, the faint, raspy laughter, echoing from somewhere deep within the machinery. He stumbled backward, his heart racing, as the laughter grew louder, mingling with the rhythmic clang of metal. His breaths came in shallow gasps as he scanned the shadows, feeling the walls close in. Just as he turned to leave, the laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence that seemed to hang in the air. And then, in the heavy quiet, he felt a cold hand brush his shoulder from behind. Marcus felt the cold hand brush his shoulder, and a jolt of panic shot through him. He spun around, heart racing, but found nothing there. Just shadows and the oppressive stillness of the factory. His instinct screamed at him to flee, but as he turned, the familiar sound of clanking metal echoed behind him again. This time, it sounded closer, more insistent. He rushed toward the exit, each step quickening, but the clanging grew louder, almost mocking him. Just as he reached the door, he felt an icy grip on his wrist, pulling him back. He gasped and turned to see a shadowy figure materializing from the darkness, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The laughter erupted again, louder now, reverberating in his ears. "Stay with us," it crooned, the words wrapping around him like chains. Marcus's breath quickened as he yanked his arm free and bolted for the door. But when he reached it, he found it locked, the handle refusing to budge. Panic surged as he turned back, realizing the figure was advancing toward him, and in that moment, he realized he was not alone anymore. Marcus felt the icy grip tighten around his wrist as the shadowy figure lunged at him, its face twisting in a nightmarish grin. Panic surged through him, and with a primal scream, he yanked his arm free and sprinted toward the nearest exit, the shadows of the factory stretching and reaching for him like hungry hands. He could hear the footsteps behind him, the laughter echoing, a mocking reminder of his helplessness. The factory floor was a maze of darkened machinery, every corner hiding something sinister. As he rounded a corner, he tripped over a loose cable and crashed to the ground. The wind knocked him out of him. Gasping for breath, he scrambled to his feet just as the figure appeared before him, illuminated by a shaft of moonlight streaming through the cracked window. Its eyes glowed with an unholy light, and it raised a bony finger to its lips, a twisted smile stretching across its face. "Shoo! They're listening," it whispered, the words slithering into Marcus's ears like venom. He backed away slowly, desperation clawing at him. The whispers returned, rising in volume, a chorus of tormented souls echoing through the factory, warning him of the impending doom. "Help us!" they cried, voices intertwining in a cacophony of fear. Marcus bolted towards the main exit, praying it would open. He reached for the door handle, but the handle wouldn't bend. It felt like it was glued shut, the shadows coiling around him as the laughter grew louder. Just then, the factory lights flickered violently, plunging him into darkness once more. In that moment of blindness, he felt the presence behind him, cold and suffocating. The figure whispered in his ear, "Stay with us forever." As the lights blinked back on, Marcus turned just in time to see the figure lunging at him, its mouth open wide, revealing a darkness deeper than the night. In that instant, all hope vanished, swallowed by the consuming shadows of the factory. Marcus managed to break free from the factory, gasping for breath as he fled into the night. But with each step he took, the laughter echoed behind him, mocking his escape. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if the darkness was clinging to him. As he reached the edge of the factory grounds, he turned back, hoping to see nothing but empty shadows. But the factory loomed, its windows now dark and soulless. The whispers returned, a chilling breeze wrapping around him. "You belong to us," they hissed, and he staggered back, realizing that the shadows had not just followed him. They had become a part of him. He ran into the night, but even as he escaped, he felt their cold presence in his mind, their laughter echoing long after he left. The darkness had taken root, and he knew he could never truly escape.